Sometimes the most profound moments in life come disguised as ordinary encounters. A worn wooden fence. Leftover food scraps, a single word whispered across cultural divides. This is the story of Maria Santos, a struggling single mother of two boys, whose desperate search for survival led her to an unlikely friendship that would transform not just her family's destiny, but challenge everything she thought she knew about kindness, heritage, and belonging. In a world where neighbors barely acknowledge each other, where difference breeds suspicion, and where pride often stands between desperation and help, one man's simple invitation would prove that humanity's greatest strength lies not in our similarities, but in our willingness to see past our differences. This is more than a story about food shared across a fence line. It's about how Half-Apache ranchers' understanding of hardship, loss, and resilience became the bridge that carried a Mexican-American family from the edge of despair to a future they never dared imagine. What began with stolen glances and shared scraps would evolve into a bond that defied every stereotype, challenged every assumption, and reminded two people that sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into, but the one brave enough to say stay when the rest of the world tells you to go. Maria Santos pressed her back against the weathered wooden fence, her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened for any sound of movement from the property beyond. The evening sun cast long shadows across the empty lot where she crouched with her two sons, 8-year-old Diego and 6-year-old Luis. Their faces were dirt-streaked and hollow with hunger that had become their constant companion over the past 3 weeks. The fence belonged to a property on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, where ramshackle houses gave way to larger parcels of desert land. Maria had discovered this spot by accident 2 days ago, when she'd been walking the boys home from their failed attempt to find work at the day labor pickup point downtown. That first evening, she'd noticed the smell of grilled meat drifting over the fence, so rich and tantalizing that her stomach had clenched painfully in response. Now, as the sun dipped lower, she knew the routine. Around this time each evening, someone on the other side would scrape plates into what sounded like a large metal container. The sounds of a meal being cleaned up, leftovers being discarded. Food that could mean the difference between her boys sleeping with something in their stomachs or lying awake again, too hungry to rest. "Mommy, I'm scared," Luis whispered, his small hand finding hers. His fingers were cold despite the desert heat that still radiated from the ground. "Shh, mijo," Maria murmured, stroking his dark hair. Just a little longer. She had never imagined her life would come to this. 6 months ago, she'd been working double shifts at a hotel in Phoenix, saving money, building towards something better for her boys. Then the hotel had closed unexpectedly, leaving her without income or references. The apartment rent had consumed her savings within weeks. When her car broke down and she couldn't afford repairs, they'd taken a Greyhound bus to Tucson, chasing a rumor about agricultural work that turned out to be false. The shelter had rules about how long families could stay, and their time had run out. Maria's pride had kept her from calling her sister in California, who had made it clear years ago that Maria's choices as a single mother were her own to live with. So here they were, camping in abandoned buildings, washing in gas station restrooms, and now reduced to waiting by someone else's fence for discarded food. The scraping sound began, metal against ceramic, and Maria's pulse quickened. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she could make out a figure moving around what appeared to be an outdoor kitchen area. The person was tall, moving with deliberate efficiency. A man, she thought, though the fading light made details difficult to distinguish. "Stay here," she whispered to the boys, though they both pressed closer to her, their fear palpable. She crept along the fence line until she found a slightly wider gap between the boards. The property beyond was larger than she'd expected, with a modest single-story house, several outbuildings, and what looked like a vegetable garden. The outdoor kitchen was clearly a permanent fixture, not just a temporary barbecue setup. This was someone's real home, their established life. The man scraped the last plate into a large metal bowl, then walked toward what she assumed was a compost pile or trash area near the back of the property. This was her chance. Maria squeezed through a loose section of the fence, her shirt catching on a protruding nail. She could hear Diego's sharp intake of breath behind her, but there was no time to reassure him. The metal bowl sat on a wooden table next to the outdoor sink. Even in the dim light, she could see there was substantial food left. Rice, what looked like grilled chicken, some kind of beans or vegetables. More food than her boys had seen in days. Her hand shook as she reached for the bowl, every instinct screaming at her to grab it and run. "Ma'am." The voice came from directly behind her, low and calm. Maria froze, her fingers inches from the rim of the bowl. She had never heard anyone approach. She turned slowly, expecting anger, threats, perhaps someone reaching for a phone to call the police. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who appeared to be in his 50s, with weathered skin and graying black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. His features suggested mixed heritage, perhaps Native American, and something else. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and his dark eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, but a kind of careful assessment. I wasn't going to take anything valuable, just the food scraps. My boys, her voice trailed off. What explanation could possibly justify this? The man said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the fence line where Diego and Luis were pressed against the gaps in the wood, their eyes wide with terror. Then he looked back at her, taking in her appearance with the same careful attention he'd given her sons. How long since they've eaten? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected accusations, demands to know what she was doing on his property. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her answer. Yesterday morning, she admitted. We had some crackers. He nodded once, then walked to the bowl she'd been reaching for. Without ceremony, he picked it up and handed it to her. There's rice, chicken, and green beans. The chicken's still warm.
Maria stared at the bowl in her hands, unable to process what was happening.
I don't understand. Your boys can come through the fence, he said, moving toward the outdoor sink.
There's more inside if they're still hungry. You don't know us, Maria protested, even as relief flooded through her. We could be dangerous. For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across his expression. Lady, you're about 110 pounds soaking wet, and you've got 2 little kids who look like they haven't had a decent meal in weeks. If you're dangerous, I'll take my chances. He began washing the plates and utensils he'd used for dinner. The sound of water and clinking dishes surprisingly normal and domestic, Maria called softly to her sons, who squeezed through the fence with the quick flexibility of children. They pressed close to her sides, staring up at the stranger with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. I'm Robert, the man said without turning around. Robert Yazzie. This is my place. Maria Santos? She replied automatically. These are my sons, Diego and Luis. Robert glanced over his shoulder at the boys. How old? 8 and 6, Maria answered, still holding the bowl of food as if it might disappear at any moment. Good ages, Robert said simply. Old enough to be useful, young enough to still listen to their mother. He finished with the dishes and turned to face them fully. You can eat at the table there, or take it with you. Your choice. The boys looked up at her with desperate hope in their eyes. The smell of the food was overwhelming now that she held it so close, but accepting felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Taking discarded food from a trash pile was one thing. Sitting at a stranger's table was something else entirely. We should go, she said finally. Thank you for the food. We'll eat it somewhere else. Robert studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. But there's always extra in the evenings. Same time tomorrow, if you need it. Maria felt tears prick her eyes. Why? Why what? You don't know anything about us. Robert leaned against the sink, his expression thoughtful. My grandmother used to say that the Creator puts people in your path for a reason. Sometimes you're supposed to help them, sometimes they're supposed to help you, sometimes both. He paused. Besides, I cook for one, but think like I'm cooking for 4. Always have too much. As they walked back toward the fence, Luis tugging at her shirt. Maria turned back once. Robert had returned to cleaning up his outdoor kitchen, moving with the same quiet efficiency as before, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if offering food to desperate strangers was simply part of his evening routine. They found a secluded spot in the vacant lot next to an abandoned gas station and sat on the ground in a small circle. Maria divided the food as evenly as she could, but still gave the larger portions to her sons. The rice was perfectly seasoned, the chicken tender and flavorful, the green beans still slightly crisp. It was the best meal any of them had eaten in weeks. Is he a good man, Mommy? Diego asked between bites, his voice already stronger now that he had food in his stomach. I think so, mijo, Maria replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what made someone good or bad anymore. Desperation had a way of scrambling such clear distinctions. Will we see him again tomorrow? Luis asked. Maria looked back toward the fence line, barely visible now in the gathering darkness. Maybe. We'll see. But even as she said it, she knew they would return. Not just because they needed the food, though they did desperately. Something about Robert Yazzie's calm acceptance, his lack of judgment, had stirred something in her that had been dormant for months. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, They weren't completely alone in the world. That night, as her boys slept curled against her in the doorway of the abandoned gas station, Maria stared up at the desert stars and tried to remember the last time a stranger had shown her kindness without expecting something in return. She came up empty. In her experience, help always came with strings attached, conditions that often made the assistance more burden than blessing. But Robert had simply handed her food and offered more tomorrow. No questions about where they were from, why they were in this situation, what their plans were. No lecture about getting back on their feet or finding proper help through official channels. Just food, offered quietly without fanfare or conditions. The next evening, Maria found herself walking toward the fence again, her sons trailing behind her with less reluctance than the night before. She had spent the day trying to find work, knocking on doors of businesses, asking about any available positions. The few people who had been willing to talk to her had looked at her appearance, her obvious desperation, and given polite dismissals that felt like doors slamming shut. By the time they reached Robert's fence, she was exhausted and discouraged, but the boys perked up at the familiar smell of cooking food drifting over the wooden barrier. "Are we going to eat at the table tonight?" Louis asked with the hopeful pragmatism of children who adapt quickly to new circumstances. "We'll see what Mr. Edge." "Robert says," Maria replied, though part of her wondered if yesterday had been a one-time gesture of charity that wouldn't be repeated. But as they approached the fence, they heard Robert's voice call out, "You can come around to the front gate tonight. It's unlocked." Maria hesitated. Going around to the front felt like a bigger step than squeezing through a gap in the back fence. It felt more intentional, more like accepting genuine hospitality rather than taking advantage of a moment of kindness. "Mummy?" Diego prompted. She took a deep breath and led her sons around the side of the property to where a simple gate stood slightly ajar. Robert was waiting by his outdoor kitchen, but tonight the table was set with actual plates and utensils. 3 places. "I figured we might as well do this properly," he said when he saw her expression. "Boys, you can wash your hands at the sink there." As Diego and Louise carefully washed their hands, Maria watched Robert serve food onto the plates. Tonight it was some kind of stew with cornbread, and the portions were generous. Not leftovers or excess, but a meal prepared with intention. "This is too much," Maria said quietly. "You're treating us like guests." "You are guests," Robert replied simply. "First rule of hospitality in my grandmother's house was that you never let anyone leave hungry if you have food to share." They sat at the wooden table as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Maria had always loved about the desert, even in her current circumstances. The boys ate with less desperate hunger than the night before, actually pausing to answer Robert's questions about their favorite subjects in school and whether they'd ever seen the desert animals that came out at night. Maria found herself watching Robert carefully as he interacted with her sons. He spoke to them with the same respectful directness he used with her, never talking down to them or treating them like children to be managed. When Luis asked why he had a ponytail, Robert explained that his hair was part of his heritage, connected to his Apache grandmother's traditions. "Are you Indian?" Diego asked with the innocent curiosity of childhood. "Half Apache, half Mexican." Robert replied without any apparent discomfort at the direct question. "My grandmother was full Apache, my grandfather was from Sonora. My father married a Mexican woman from Tucson, and that's how I ended up looking like a little bit of everything." "My abuela was from Mexico too," Luis said excitedly. "From a place called Guadalajara." "That's a beautiful city," Robert said. "I've been there a few times. Good food, good people." As the evening progressed, Maria began to relax despite herself. Robert's conversation was easy and unforced, moving naturally from questions about the boys' interests to stories about the wildlife on his property. He mentioned finding a family of javelinas in his vegetable garden the previous week, which had both boys giggling as he described chasing them away with a wooden spoon while trying not to hurt them. When it came time to leave, Robert packed the leftover stew and cornbread into containers for them to take. "Tomorrow's Saturday," he said as he handed Maria the containers. "I usually do some work around the property in the morning, fix things that need fixing. If you're interested, I could use some help. Pay as food, and maybe a few dollars if the work's good." Maria felt her heart skip. "You're offering work? Simple stuff?" Robert clarified. "Clearing brush, organizing tools, maybe helping with some fence repairs. Nothing too complicated, but it needs doing. And I'm not as young as I used to be." "Yes," Maria said immediately, then caught herself. "I mean, if you're sure." "I'm a good worker, and I learn quickly." "I figured you were," Robert said, with that same slight amusement she'd noticed the first night. Be here around 8 if you're interested. Bring the boys if you need to. There's plenty of safe places for them to play while we work. As they walked away from the property, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not just hope, but actual anticipation for tomorrow. Not because it might bring desperate solutions to desperate problems, but because it might bring the simple satisfaction of honest work and fair payment. I like Mr. Robert, Luis announced as they made their way back to their sleeping spot. Me too, Diego agreed. He talks to us like we're real people. Maria smiled in the darkness. Her sons had put their finger on exactly what felt different about Robert Yazzie. He treated them all like real people, worthy of respect and basic dignity, regardless of their circumstances. In a world that had increasingly made her feel invisible or unwanted, his straightforward acceptance was like cool water in the desert. That night, for the first time in weeks, Maria fell asleep without the gnawing anxiety that had become her constant companion. Tomorrow would bring work, honest work, and the chance to earn rather than accept charity. It was a small thing perhaps, but it felt like the first step back toward the person she used to be, before desperation had worn away so much of her confidence and self-respect. She didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that Robert's simple offer of work would evolve into something none of them could have predicted, that his understanding of what it meant to be caught between cultures, between belonging and displacement, would create a bridge between their worlds that went far deeper than shared meals and fair employment. All she knew was that for the first time in months, tomorrow felt like possibility, rather than just another day to survive. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of desert sunrise that painted everything in golden light. Maria woke her sons before dawn, using water from a gallon jug they'd filled at a gas station to help them wash their faces and smooth their hair. She wanted them to look presentable for their first day of real work in months. They arrived at Robert's gate exactly at 8 o'clock. Maria had always been punctual, even when punctuality seemed to matter less and less in her current circumstances. Robert was already working in his garden, pulling weeds from around tomato plants that were heavy with fruit. "Morning," he called when he saw them approach. "Hope you're ready to get dirty." He led them on a tour of the property, pointing out the various projects that needed attention. The fence line along the back needed reinforcement in several places. There was a pile of scrap metal that needed to be sorted and hauled to recycling. His tool shed required organization after years of throwing things wherever they fit. The chicken coop needed cleaning and fresh bedding. Nothing glamorous, Robert said as they completed the circuit, but all necessary. Maria surveyed the work with the practiced eye of someone who had held numerous manual labor jobs over the years. "Where would you like us to start?" "Tool shed," Robert decided. "That'll give you a chance to learn where everything goes, and the boys can help without getting into anything dangerous." The shed was indeed a disaster. Tools were mixed with spare parts, gardening supplies were scattered among automotive equipment, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. But as Maria began sorting through the chaos, she found herself appreciating the quality of Robert's tools. Everything was well made and well maintained, just poorly organized. Diego and Luis proved surprisingly helpful, their small hands able to reach into corners and crevices that the adults couldn't access easily. Robert had given them specific jobs, sorting screws by size and organizing smaller hand tools by type. They took their responsibilities seriously, working with the focused concentration children brought to tasks when they felt genuinely useful. As the morning progressed, Maria found herself falling into a comfortable working rhythm with Robert. He was an efficient partner, anticipating what she needed and adjusting his pace to match hers. More importantly, he didn't hover or micromanage, trusting her to figure out the best way to organize each section of the shed. "You've done this kind of work before," he observed, as they took a break for water around 10 o'clock. "Different kinds of work," Maria replied, grateful for the cold water he provided from a cooler. "Hotels, restaurants, some warehouse jobs. You learn to organize efficiently or everything takes twice as long." "Good skill to have," Robert said. "Organization's half the battle in most jobs." They worked through the morning, stopping only when the desert heat became too intense for the boys to be comfortable outside. Robert suggested they move to indoor projects during the heat of the day and led them into his house for the first time. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and walls decorated with a mixture of southwestern art and what appeared to be family photographs. Maria noticed several pictures that seemed to show Robert at different ages with various people, including an elderly woman who shared his facial features. "That's my grandmother," Robert said, noticing her attention to the photos. "Elena Yazzie." She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. I'm sorry, Maria said automatically. Long time ago, Robert replied, but something in his tone suggested the loss still mattered. She taught me most of what I know about taking care of myself and others. Died about 15 years ago. The indoor project turned out to be organizing a large closet that served as storage for household supplies and seasonal items. It was cooler work, but just as necessary as the outdoor tasks. Maria found herself impressed by how much Robert had accumulated over the years, yet how little of it seemed wasteful or frivolous. Everything had a purpose, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. You live alone out here? She asked as they worked. Mostly, Robert said. I was married for a while, but she wanted city life more than I wanted to leave this place. No hard feelings, just different priorities. That was about 10 years ago. Doesn't it get lonely? Robert considered this as he handed her a box of holiday decorations to sort through. Sometimes, but I've got the animals, and I stay busy. Loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. I've never minded my own company. They broke for lunch around noon, and Robert surprised Maria by producing sandwiches and cold drinks for all of them. The bread was homemade, she realized, and the turkey was sliced thick and seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. Did you make this bread? She asked. Yesterday afternoon, Robert confirmed. I bake twice a week usually. Bread, sometimes cookies or muffins, if I'm feeling ambitious. Louise looked up from his sandwich with obvious amazement. You can make bread? Not hard once you get the hang of it, Robert said. Maybe I'll show you boys sometime, if your mother doesn't mind. Both boys looked at Maria with hopeful expressions. She felt a familiar pang of inadequacy, thinking about all the things she couldn't provide for them, all the experiences they were missing because of their circumstances. That would be nice, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. After lunch, they returned to outdoor work, focusing on the fence repairs Robert had mentioned. This proved to be more complex than the morning's organizing, requiring actual construction skills. Maria watched carefully as Robert demonstrated how to replace damaged fence posts and secure new boards. The trick is making sure everything's level, he explained as he showed her how to use a level tool. Fence doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's obviously crooked, it looks sloppy and won't hold up as well. Maria had never done this kind of work before, but she found it satisfying in a way that surprised her. There was something deeply practical about fixing something that was broken, about creating order and stability where there had been weakness. As the afternoon progressed, she began to understand why Robert seemed so content with his solitary life. There was peace in this kind of work, in the slow process of maintaining and improving the place where you lived. The boys had grown tired of helping and were now exploring other parts of the property under Robert's watchful eye. They had discovered his small flock of chickens and were delighted by the birds' personalities and antics. Luis had apparently decided that one particular hen was his favorite and had named her Rosa. She likes me, he announced proudly when the hen allowed him to pet her feathers. Chickens are good judges of character, Robert told him seriously. If Rosa likes you, you must be all right. As the sun began to set, they finished the fence section they'd been working on and stood back to admire their handiwork. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid and straight, and Maria felt a genuine sense of accomplishment looking at it. Good work, Robert said, and she could tell he meant it. You learn fast and you don't give up when something's hard, both valuable traits. He paid her $50 in cash for the day's work, more than she had expected. Same time tomorrow if you're interested, he added. Got plenty more projects that need attention. As they prepared to leave, Robert packed leftovers from their lunch and added some fresh vegetables from his garden. Boys did good work too, he said as he handed Maria a bag containing tomatoes, peppers, and what looked like fresh herbs. They earned their share. Walking away from the property that evening, Maria felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. Her back ached pleasantly from honest physical labor, her hands were dirty from productive work, and her sons were chattering excitedly about their day. For the first time since their circumstances had deteriorated, she felt like herself again. Mammy, are we going to work with Mr. Tordmangle? Robert, every day? Diego asked as they settled in for the night. For a while, Maria replied. As long as he needs help and we need work. I hope it's a long while, Louise said sleepily. I want to learn how to make bread. That night, Maria lay awake thinking about the day, replaying conversations and moments that had surprised her. Robert's easy acceptance of her children's presence in his workspace, his patience when explaining unfamiliar tasks, the way he had treated her as a skilled partner rather than desperate charity case. But more than his kindness, she found herself thinking about his stories of his grandmother, his comments about loneliness and solitude, is matter-of-fact acceptance of life's disappointments and changes. There was a steadiness to Robert Yazzie that she found both comforting and puzzling. In her experience, people who had been hurt became either bitter or overly cautious. Robert seemed to be neither. The pattern continued for the rest of the week. Each morning, Maria and her sons arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. Each day brought different projects, different challenges, different opportunities to learn new skills. Robert proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to repair plumbing, tend a vegetable garden, and maintain small engines. The boys settled into their own routine, helping where they could and exploring the property when their help wasn't needed. Robert seemed to enjoy their presence, answering their endless questions about everything from why chickens couldn't fly to how cacti stored water. He treated their curiosity as natural and valuable, never dismissing their questions as childish or unimportant. By Friday evening, Maria realized she was no longer thinking of this as temporary help or charity. She was thinking of it as a job, the kind of steady employment she had been searching for since arriving in Tucson. More than that, she was thinking of Robert as a friend, someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed rather than simply endured out of necessity. "What are your plans for the weekend?" Robert asked, as they finished cleaning tools at the end of the week. Maria hesitated. The honest answer was that they had no plans beyond finding safe places to sleep and hoping their small savings would stretch to cover basic needs. But admitting this felt like breaking the spell of normalcy they had built over the past week. "Nothing special," she said finally. Robert nodded, seeming to understand the subtext of her answer. "If you're interested, I usually do some cooking on Sundays. Bigger meals, things that take more time during the week. Could use some help if you're not busy." "Cooking help?" Maria asked. "My grandmother used to say that food tastes better when it's prepared by more than one pair of hands," Robert explained. "Besides, I've been eating my own cooking for 15 years. Might be nice to have someone else's input for a change." Maria felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. The invitation felt different from the work arrangement they had developed. More personal, more like genuine friendship than practical necessity. "We'd like that," she said quietly. "Good," Robert replied. "Come around 10 on Sunday. We'll figure out what to make together." That weekend, for the first time since arriving in Tucson, Maria allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have stability again. Not just financially, though that was important, but socially and emotionally. To have a place where she and her boys were welcome, where their presence was valued rather than tolerated. She didn't dare to hope for too much. Experience had taught her that good things could disappear as quickly as they appeared, often when she least expected it. But as she watched her sons sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed and content in a way she hadn't seen for months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth holding on to. Sunday morning arrived bright and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming desert plants. Maria dressed her sons in their cleanest clothes and braided her own hair carefully. She wanted to look like someone worthy of genuine friendship, not just someone grateful for temporary charity. When they arrived at Robert's house, the front door was open and music was playing softly from inside. Something with guitars and a woman singing in Spanish, beautiful and melancholy. Robert appeared in the doorway before they could knock, wearing an apron over his usual work clothes. "Perfect timing," he said with a smile. "I was just wondering what we should make for breakfast." The kitchen was larger than it had appeared from her previous glimpses, with a big wooden table and windows that looked out over the vegetable garden. Sunlight streamed in, making everything warm and golden. It felt like the heart of a real home, the kind of kitchen where families gathered and important conversations happened over shared meals. "What do you boys like to eat?" Robert asked Diego and Luis directly. "Pancakes," Luis said immediately. "Eggs," Diego added. "And bacon if there is any." "I think we can manage all of that," Robert said. "Your mother can help me with the pancakes while you boys set the table. Sound like a plan?" As they worked together, measuring flour and cracking eggs, Maria found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in months. The simple domesticity of cooking breakfast together felt natural and comfortable, as if they had been doing this for years rather than days. "You're good at this," Robert observed as she whisked pancake batter to the perfect consistency. "I used to cook a lot," Maria replied. "When we had our own place, I made most of our meals from scratch. It was cheaper and healthier than eating out or buying prepared food."
"Practical and smart," Robert said approvingly.
"My grandmother was the same way. She could make a feast out of ingredients most people would throw away. As they ate breakfast together at the big wooden table, with morning sunlight streaming through the windows and her boys chattering happily about their favorite foods, Maria felt a deep sense of rightness that she couldn't quite explain. This felt like how mornings should be. This felt like home in a way that went beyond having four walls and a roof over their heads. After breakfast, Robert suggested they spend the day planning and preparing a larger meal together. Something that takes time, he said. Something we can all work on together. They decided on tamales, a project that would require hours of preparation but would yield enough food for several meals. Robert admitted he had never made tamales before, but he was eager to learn. Maria found herself taking the lead, directing him and the boys through the process of preparing masa, cooking, filling, and assembling each individual tamale. It felt good to be the teacher for once, to share knowledge rather than constantly learning new skills. Robert proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and following her directions with careful attention to detail. The boys helped with simple tasks, spreading masa and adding filling their small hands, surprisingly adept at the delicate work. As they worked, they talked about food traditions from their respective families, stories about special meals and holiday celebrations. Maria found herself sharing memories she hadn't thought about in years, descriptions of her grandmother's kitchen in Los Angeles, and the elaborate preparations for Christmas Eve dinner. Food is memory, Robert said as they worked together, his hands learning the rhythm of spreading masa on corn husks. My grandmother used to say that when you cook someone's traditional food, you're honoring everyone who came before them. By evening, they had produced several dozen tamales, more than enough for immediate consumption and plenty left over. They cooked the first batch in Robert's large steamer and sat down to enjoy the fruits of their collective labor as the sun set over the desert. These are incredible, Robert said after his first bite. Better than any restaurant I've ever tried. It's because we made them together, Maria replied, echoing something her own grandmother had once told her. Food always tastes better when it's made with love and good company. As they cleaned up together, working with the easy coordination they had developed over the week, Maria realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer stranger and grateful recipient, employer and desperate employee. They had become something closer to family, people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being and enjoyed each other's company. Next Sunday? Robert asked as they prepared to leave. Next Sunday, Maria agreed. And for the first time in months, she was making plans for the future, with genuine confidence that those plans would actually happen. 3 weeks into their new routine, everything changed on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Maria and her sons arrived at Robert's property at their usual time, ready for another day of productive work and companionable conversation. But as they approached the house, Maria noticed a sheriff's deputy's car parked in the driveway. Her blood turned to ice. After months of living on the margins, any encounter with law enforcement felt like a potential catastrophe. Her first instinct was to grab her sons and run, but Luis had already called out a cheerful greeting to Robert, who was standing on his front porch talking to the uniformed officer. "Morning, Maria," Robert called, his voice calm, but something in his expression alerting her to stay cautious. "Officer Martinez here is just following up on some reports from neighbors." The deputy turned toward them, his gaze taking in Maria's work clothes and the boys flanked protectively at her sides. He was young, perhaps in his 30s, with the kind of serious expression that could mean anything from routine questioning to serious trouble. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said politely, "I understand you and your children have been staying in the area recently." "We've been working for Mr. Yazzie," she managed. "Working," the officer repeated, making a note in a small pad. "And where have you been residing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria knew that admitting they had been sleeping in abandoned buildings or doorways could lead to charges of trespassing or vagrancy. It could mean losing her boys to protective services while she dealt with legal problems. It could mean the end of everything they've been building with Robert. "They've been staying here," Robert said before Maria could answer. Officer Martinez looked between them with obvious skepticism. "Here on your property, Mr. Yazzie?" "That's right," Robert replied calmly. "They're helping me with maintenance and upkeep in exchange for room and board. Been working out well for everyone involved." Maria stared at Robert, unable to believe what she was hearing. He was lying to a police officer to protect them, claiming they lived on his property when they had never stayed there even one night. "I see," the officer said, still making notes. "How long has this arrangement been in place?" "About a month now," Robert replied without hesitation. "Maria is an excellent worker, and her boys are well-behaved and helpful." Officer Martinez asked a few more questions about their living situation and work arrangement, all of which Robert answered with calm confidence. Finally, he closed his notepad and looked directly at Maria. "Ma'am, I need to ask you directly. Are you and your children safe here? Is this arrangement voluntary?"
Yes.
Maria said quietly, her voice stronger than she felt. "Yes, we're safe and it's voluntary." The officer nodded and handed Robert a business card. "Well, everything seems to be in order here. If you have any problems, don't hesitate to call." After the deputy left, Maria and Robert stood in awkward silence while the boys, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of what had just happened, wandered off to check on their favorite chickens.
"You lied to a police officer," Maria said finally.
"I told him you were staying here," Robert replied. "That doesn't have to be a lie." Maria felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" Robert walked over to lean against his front porch railing, choosing his words carefully. "I mean that I've got more space than I need. You and the boys need somewhere safe to stay. And we've been working well together for weeks now. Seems like maybe we could make this official." "You're offering to let us live here?" Maria asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm suggesting we might be able to help each other on a more permanent basis," Robert clarified. "You keep working with me on the property maintenance, maybe take over some of the cooking and household management I'm not great at. In exchange, you and the boys get a safe place to live and steady income." Maria felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Robert, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," he pointed out. "I'm offering. There's a difference." She looked around the property that had become so familiar over the past weeks, imagining what it would mean for her sons to have a real home again. A place where they could play safely, sleep peacefully, attend school consistently. A place where they could belong. "Why?" she asked, the same question that had puzzled her that first night when he'd handed her food without question. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the landscape he had called home for so many years. "When I was growing up with my grandmother, people came and went from our place all the time. Relatives who needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet. Friends who were between jobs or dealing with family problems. It was just what you did for people who mattered to you." He paused, then looked directly at her. "You and your boys matter to me now. This place is too big for one person anyway and too quiet. Maybe we can all benefit from a different arrangement." Before Maria could respond, Luis came running back from the chicken coop, his face bright with excitement. "Mommy, Rosa laid an egg and I found it," he announced, holding up a perfect brown egg like a trophy. "That's wonderful, mijo," Maria said automatically, but her mind was reeling with the implications of Robert's offer. "Can we have it for breakfast tomorrow?" Luis asked hopefully. "If Mr. Morrow..." "Robert says it's okay," Maria replied, then caught herself. If they accepted his offer, this would be their home too. The eggs would be partly theirs, the breakfast table would be partly theirs, the decisions would be made together rather than deferred to his sole authority. "Tell you what," Robert said to Luis, clearly aware of the symbolic weight of the moment. "Why don't you and Diego go collect any other eggs you can find, and we'll have fresh eggs for breakfast every day?" Both boys raced off eagerly, and Maria watched them go with a mixture of love and uncertainty. They had adapted so quickly to this place, to Robert's calm presence and steady routines. They were happier here than they had been anywhere since leaving Phoenix. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course," Robert agreed. "It's a big decision. Take whatever time you need." They spent the rest of the day working on installing new shelving in Robert's storage room, but the conversation hung between them, unfinished and full of possibility. Maria found herself looking at everything differently now, noticing details about the house and property that would matter if she and her boys were going to call it home. The house had 3 bedrooms, she realized. Robert used one as his bedroom and another as an office, but the third was currently used for storage. It was a good size, with windows that faced east toward the morning sun. It would be perfect for the boys to share. The kitchen was large enough for multiple people to cook together comfortably. The living room had space for children's toys and books. The yard was safe and enclosed, with plenty of room for Diego and Luis to play and explore. More importantly, there was a sense of peace here that Maria had rarely experienced, even before their current troubles began. Robert's property felt removed from the stress and uncertainty of the outside world, a place where time moved more slowly and problems seemed more manageable. That evening, as they shared another meal together around Robert's table, Maria watched her sons chattering with him about their day's discoveries. They had found a lizard sunning itself on a rock, learned that chickens could jump higher than they expected, and helped Robert identify a plant that was growing wild near the back fence. "Mr. Robert," Diego said suddenly. If we lived here, would we have to go to a different school?
Robert glanced at Maria before answering.
There's a good elementary school about 15 minutes away, he said carefully. It's where the local kids go, and I've heard good things about the teachers. Would we have our own room? Louise asked with the directness of childhood. You'd have to share, Robert replied. But it would be your room. You could decorate it however you wanted and keep your things there. Both boys looked at Maria with hopeful expressions that nearly broke her heart. She could see how much they wanted this, how much they needed the stability and security that Robert was offering. After dinner, while the boys played a board game Robert had produced from a closet, Maria stepped outside onto the front porch to think. The desert evening was cool and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, she could hear the soft sounds of night wildlife beginning their evening activities. Robert joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Penny for your thoughts, he said, settling into a chair beside her. I'm scared, Maria admitted. I'm scared to believe this is real, scared to depend on someone again, scared to let my boys get attached to something that might disappear. All reasonable fears, Robert acknowledged. I can't promise that nothing will ever go wrong or change, but I can promise that any changes won't be sudden or arbitrary. We're both adults, we can communicate about problems and work things out together. Maria sipped her coffee, thinking about the months of uncertainty and instability that had led them to this moment. What if it doesn't work out? What if we drive each other crazy living in the same house? Then we'll figure out a different arrangement, Robert said simply. Maybe you get your own place nearby and we continue working together. Maybe I help you get settled somewhere else. There are lots of options that don't involve anyone being abandoned or left worse off than they started. The reassurance in his voice was exactly what she needed to hear. This wasn't an all-or-nothing proposition, and Robert wasn't the kind of person who would withdraw his friendship if living together proved impractical. My boys have been through so much change already, she said quietly. I want to be sure this is going to be good for them. Look at them, Robert said, nodding toward the window where Diego and Luis could be seen laughing over their board game. When's the last time you saw them that relaxed and happy? He was right. Her sons had blossomed over the past few weeks, becoming more confident and talkative, sleeping more peacefully, playing with the carefree enthusiasm she remembered from their early childhood. Even if this arrangement was temporary, it had already been healing for them. There's something else, Maria said, voicing a concern that had been nagging at her. People are going to talk. A single woman and her children moving in with a bachelor man. They're going to make assumptions. Robert was quiet for a moment. Let them assume whatever they want, he said finally. People who know us will see the truth. People who don't know us don't matter. It doesn't bother you? The potential gossip? I'm 53 years old, Robert replied with amusement. If I was going to start worrying about gossip, I probably should have begun decades ago. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars emerge more clearly as the sky darkened completely. Maria found herself imagining what it would be like to sit on this porch every evening, to have this peace and beauty as a regular part of their lives rather than a temporary respite. Okay, she said finally. Okay meaning you'll think about it more. Or, okay meaning yes? Robert asked. Okay meaning yes, Maria replied, her heart pounding with the magnitude of the decision. If you're sure about this, if you really think it could work, then yes, we'll try it. Robert smiled, the first truly broad smile she had seen from him since they'd met. I'm sure, he said, and I think it's going to work out better than any of us expect. The transition happened gradually over the next 2 weeks. Maria and her son started spending nights at the house. First just occasionally, then more regularly as they all adjusted to the new arrangement. Robert cleared out the spare bedroom and helped Diego and Luis arrange their few possessions in a way that made the space feel truly theirs. Maria took over most of the cooking and household management, responsibilities she was glad to assume after weeks of feeling like a dependent guest. Robert proved to be an easy housemate, neat and considerate, willing to accommodate her routines and preferences without complaint. The boys enrolled in the local elementary school, where they quickly made friends and impressed their teachers with their enthusiasm for learning. Having a stable address and consistent adult support made all the difference in their academic and social adjustment. Most importantly, the work arrangement evolved into a genuine partnership. Maria discovered she had a talent for organizing Robert's business dealings with suppliers and customers, while he taught her advanced maintenance and repair skills that would serve her well regardless of their future circumstances. 6 months later, as Maria watched her sons playing in the yard while she and Robert planned the next day's projects, she marveled at how completely their lives had changed. They had gone from desperate and homeless to secure and hopeful. All because one man had been willing to see past their circumstances to their essential humanity. No regrets? Robert asked, noticing her contemplative mood. None. Maria replied honestly. This has been the best thing that's happened to us in years. For me too, Robert admitted. I didn't realize how much I missed having a family around until you three showed up. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing stories about their day, Luis looked up from his plate with the serious expression he wore when he had something important to say. Mr. Robert, he began formally, thank you for letting us stay forever. Robert met Maria's eyes across the table, both of them smiling at Luis's childlike assumption that forever was a given in their arrangement. Thank you for staying, Robert replied simply. All of you. And in that moment, Maria understood that they had all found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Not just shelter or employment or temporary assistance, but a real home with people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being, a place where they could build a future together, one day at a time, one shared meal at a time, one small kindness at a time. The word stay had become more than an invitation. It had become a promise that they would continue building this unlikely family, this blend of cultures and histories and hopes that somehow fit together as perfectly as pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known was incomplete. Outside, the desert night settled around their house with its familiar sounds and scents. Inside, three people who had started as strangers planned tomorrow's work and talked about next week's goals and dreamed about next year's possibilities. They had learned that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the simple act of sharing what you have with someone who needs it, and that the most profound transformations happen when people choose to see each other as family rather than strangers. Maria had thought they were just looking for food when she first approached Robert's fence. She had discovered they were looking for home. And in Robert's quiet wisdom and steady kindness, in his willingness to say stay when the rest of the world had told them to move along, they had found it.